Stellar Blade does so many things right. A satisfying combat system, great enemy variety, a solid enough progression loop. At times, it's baffling design decisions that really let the experience down around world structure, presentation, and writing. The highs of Stellar Blade far outweigh the lows, but it's at times confusing when you take a step back and look at the whole picture. It's a hard game to articulate. Let me know any questions you have about Stellar Blade in the comments.
Wow, a whole city underneath the wasteland.
So I always start with graphics and performance. We've got 3 graphical modes here. You've got your fidelity, which is like your 30 FPS mode. It doesn't feel like a locked 30 FPS to me. It may be, but it just didn't feel like it. Performance for a locked 60 FPS, which is definitely basically locked, it does seem like. And the balance mode, which is like somewhere in between. I played almost exclusively on the balance mode as I felt it was like a good medium between having the resolution drop to like 2 pixels from the performance mode and then having like the lack of FPS, which is really important for an action game like this in the fidelity mode. The world graphically though is very hit and miss. Like texture quality on things like Eve and the NPCs and enemies and even some of the boss variety and stuff as well is absolutely fantastic. Like there is design talent at Shift Up, the studio, that like has to be called out here, right? Like it's very clear that these guys know how to design characters, especially enemies, and they look fantastic, but it's the world surrounding these characters that there's a lot of inconsistencies with that you start to notice them appearing. There is really like only 2-ish open world sort of areas. They're both very like plain desert areas with like a ton of brown, with a lack of visual variety and flair, especially in the second one. And Zion, the city hub as well, suffers from that sort of lack of fidelity and sort of low poly textures that surround the buildings and the environments, and just sort of a flat texture and color palette, which is a little bit jarring when you look at characters like Eve and some of these enemies that have these really oversaturated colors that sort of pop on the screen, that when compared to the environment, they're sort of jarring in that way. The linear inside areas of the game don't suffer from this though, like they have a really clear visual fidelity. So it's hard to gauge if this is like a performance decision or a design decision or somewhere in the middle, but it's just that sort of lack of overall clarity in the environmental variety is a little bit disappointing. But luckily though, the combat and the gameplay holds up in any environment. So Stellar Blade is Shift Up's first console game and their first like AAA, game, and there's a huge difference between making like mobile gacha games to like a console action adventure Souls-light experience, and I think that any criticism of the game needs to take that into account, as at times you can see the inexperience from the developers in this style of game. Before I gush about like the combat system, I wanted to talk about sort of the levels and the gameplay as a whole. I mentioned in my preview how the gameplay, is very heavily inspired by Nier Automata, but I actually think it's closer to a Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order / Survivor, right? This is an action adventure, but it's definitely a Souls-light, not Souls-like. And the difference being, there are Souls elements here, but it's not a traditional Souls game. You don't lose anything when you die, but it does follow a very typical Souls loop of exploring and killing enemies, getting XP, leveling up, and all that good stuff, right? Now, the Jedi elements on top of that come in with the parkour,
Eve, whatever you do, don't look down. Oh, come on.
the movement-based puzzles, as well as some of the environmental puzzles and pacing mechanics that it's used to, create shortcuts to your last like campfire, bonfire, that sort of thing. Now, these puzzles, at least in the early game, aren't really tough or overly engaging. Like, you sort of just stumble across completing them. Like, if you play games like I do, you ignore the main objective and explore first, and you'll just like stumble across the answer to a puzzle you weren't even aware you were supposed to be solving, and you'll just like open that locked door that you hadn't even clicked on yet. The issue with some of the level design and environmental structure is that Shift Up hasn't really done a great job of indicating to you what's interactable and what isn't. So you have to heavily rely on the scanner, like the ping system, to like highlight anything that's interactable in this like glowing yellow. Now, this is anything from handholds to pathways, buttons to press, loot, like literally everything. And this over reliance on this ping system is a bit of a negative here. Like, I don't really like to spam a ping system every 2 seconds just to, make sure that I'm not missing anything, or like try and actually solve things, it does get a little bit annoying. In some of the later game, the puzzles can be straight up infuriating in some cases. Some of the movement-based puzzles especially. Now, there is a difficulty setting here, right? Like between story and normal, and then once you complete the game, you unlock hard. Now, Sony and PlayStation have always been incredible with accessibility options and allowing the player to play the game how they choose. Now, you can put the game on story difficulty, that's totally fine, but that doesn't solve the issue of the complexity in some of these movement-based puzzles, and there is no skip button, right? Like some of these puzzles, like it took me, 15, 20 minutes or so to get past. Now, I wouldn't say I'm, a gamer pro here or anything, but just part of me as a reviewer and thinking about how other people are going to enjoy this experience, I was slightly infuriated, and if you struggle with that sort of movement-based mechanics in games, then this is definitely something that you might struggle with here. Now, outside of this, there is that sort of like semi-open world sections that you can explore and do side quests on. I'm just not really a huge fan of this. Like those areas aren't very large and there's not a whole lot of variety in them in terms of, what you're sort of finding. There is a cool little fishing mini game that you'll come across as well. But otherwise, like a lot of the quests here are just very fetch quests. It's just go and get me, some scissors and something, like it's not, there's no real depth to them overall. There's a couple exceptions to that, but for the most part here, they're just very much like go out into those areas and collect something and bring them back to Zion for that person. The reason that games like this, especially combat heavy games, have these sort of movement based puzzles or just like more interactable puzzles as well is simply as like a pacing mechanic, right? So that you're not being like forced into combat for the entire experience. They give you those moments to breathe, smell the roses, and that sort of a thing, right? Now, that's all well and good, but it is a little annoying when there's aren't a lot of depth there. One thing that I absolutely loved that I wish there was more of are there are these moments where the game takes away your blade, right? It is Stellar Blade and it takes away the blade. You can only use your ranged weapons, and the game sort of turns into like this survival horror almost aspect in these like dark corridors when you've only got access to a ranged weapon that has limited ammunition. So you're trying to balance like using your ammo correctly. I actually really loved these moments, right? Like I felt that really changed up the gameplay in a really satisfying and interesting way, which does give you a nice different way of tackling with combat, especially because the game is very combat heavy, which luckily the combat is excellent. The combat in Stellar Blade is absolutely one of the best combat systems that you will play this year. Hands down, it's like there's just some fantastic work that's been put into the feel of combat. Like these action games, it's not necessarily about, how tight you can make the hitboxes, which speaking of the hitboxes in Stellar Blade are absolutely fantastic. Like you can jump over attacks and do all that stuff. Love that kind of intricacy, like using attacks in that way. But you've got a complex combat system here that it takes a little bit to get going, but once you understand it, it really does excel. So you've got your basic attack skills and the different combos you can execute there that will allow you to move around the battlefield in that way. You've got your beta skills here that'll allow you to use something like Shield Breaker to lower the amount of shield that enemies have. Once you break down that shield, they take more like health damage, which obviously you want to do. And then as you progress, you unlock burst skills for even more complex skill usage, and then there's like an ultimate ability that you'll get like much later in the game as well. Now, outside of this, what really makes this combat system sing is the way that you can interact with the enemy attacks. Now, you've got your typical way that basically all these action games do from parrying. Now, parrying here feels so good. There's just like a really good weighty impact to being able to parry. I actually found that the parry timers felt a lot more tuned in this full release than the demo does. Like the window of the parry timing feels like it's much shorter here, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something I noticed like playing through the intro and the start again. Now, other than that, you've got these other two ways to interact like with these like perfect parry systems. You've got like the perfect dodge, which will give you some invincibility frames on your dodge, which you otherwise don't have. Then you've got like repulse and the other ways you can interact with certain attacks, right? I talked about in my preview that I didn't totally understand the different coloring systems from the enemies, because like sometimes they'll glow blue or orange or purple or red, what have you. Now, if they glow blue, you can use like your dodge and like trigger like a animation animation to like zoom through them and then attack from behind like stun, or the purple where you can like attack from behind, and if you dodge and pull the analog stick back, you'll do like a backflip, like sort of stagger them to then follow up with range attacks. All this stuff feels absolutely amazing when you're fighting one enemy, right? That's really critical here, is having to attack one enemy, which luckily all the bosses are essentially one enemy. Now that feels fantastic when you get these attacks off, and like the game does a really good job of feeling that like reward, like the dopamine of like triggering these effects and being like, yeah, you know, you did it. But the downside here is that in larger groups, when enemies try and do these attacks together, like simultaneously, because they're directional inputs from using dodge to either like using the pushing left analog stick forward or back, it's hard to get them to trigger properly when multiple enemies are doing it. You've got to be like targeting the right one and in the right position, and it's just really hard to get those effects off. And those attacks deal a ton of damage when you miss these effects, which is part of the, you know, that challenge of the game. And it's just that sometimes in group scenarios, the combat system doesn't hold up super well, but luckily they're sort of few and far between, and it's mostly just trash enemies that you can sort of skip past if you want to. But all the boss encounters are really, really strong here, and I enjoyed every single one. They also have great visual design, not only from their boss arenas, but also the bosses themselves. Absolute highlight here, and I don't want to spoil too many of the boss encounters so that you can experience them for yourself. But also the music in some of these boss encounters, like best you will experience, like absolutely incredible. Some of the ways that the game shifts from different genres of music just so cleanly, really, really strong. Like some of these boss fights have these like cool like K-pop pop sort of beats, and then some of them have like these real heavy metal, like, oh, just so good, man. Like the music and the presentation of these boss encounters on another tier, like just such a vibe. Like really, really love this stuff. But what I will say though that feels a little at odds with the game is that sort of in the last act, or maybe the last 3 to 5-ish hours or so, the game essentially just becomes like a boss rush mode. Like all that open world stuff that we touched on with puzzles and everything all disappears. It essentially just becomes like a boss rush mode where you might fight some trash in between, but the last sort of act of the game is essentially just going from boss to boss to boss, and that pacing does struggle, especially with some of those really tougher bosses that if you can't get past them, you're essentially just stuck there, right? There's no other way that you can progress or do anything. Your only solution is to just beat that encounter, or, you know, change your skills, level up in that way. Now, I did talk about in my preview the progression system and being worried about the progression lacking impact or clear build expression, as the exospine and the equipment didn't seem to have like clear synergies or a solid connective tissue. I was kind of wrong here, but also kind of right in a way. So there's some quality gear here that you can upgrade with like the repair console that does have synergy. Like my favorite set was one that has like a critical hit that does like a little electric charge that'll spread to other enemies when you critically hit. So obviously I used gear in my gear sockets and my other exo spine suit that increased my critical hit rate as well as my critical hit damage. But there isn't enough pieces of diverse gear here that allows you to create something truly unique or truly interesting. Like most of the gear pieces and gear sockets give you passive stat increases, say like increasing your overall critical hit chance or your beta skill damage or burst skill damage or the recharge rate of them, etc. Now this is all fine, like there's nothing wrong with this. This is very typical in like games like this and everything. But what's sort of disappointing is that there is a fair chunk of skills, like maybe half of them in fact, that do this exact same thing, that just, you know, improve recharge rates or increase the attack power of these things. And it leads to the skill tree itself being quite bloated, as you do start with the 3 initial skill trees, and then as you progress through the game you'll unlock 2 more. But like maybe 30-40% of these skills are essentially things that are on the exospines and gear sockets as well, as they're just increasing the attack power, lowering recharge rate, etc. And it leads to sort of a confusing skill system as you're looking at all these different trees and which ones you want to focus on, especially when there are like legitimate tangible skills that are almost required that you need to unlock, like the repulse and the counter skills that I was talking about earlier. Now you absolutely need these in order to beat certain bosses. Like it's basically a requirement. You would just straight up die otherwise. And they sort of get lost in the pack when you're looking at these trees. It's hard to find the right ones. Now, weapon damage progression is also just linear. Like essentially here, you'll defeat a boss, you'll get a weapon core upgrade. You'll just put that on your weapon. It'll increase its overall damage. This doesn't feel impactful, as enemies will just scale to that new damage anyway, because progression here through the game is linear. So obviously the game's expecting you to have that new damage upgrade, so then all the enemies sort of scale with that. That's sort of disappointing, as it doesn't feel like you're getting impact from getting that actual damage increase, because you can't feel tangibly that you've actually gained in power because enemies are scaling to that like new damage amount, right? So overall here, like regardless of, the skill and equipped gear and your drone upgrades as well, like the other weird detail is that enemies always drop gold, right? Now you'll use that gold to like buy various items at Zion in the early to mid-ish game, and then after that point you really will only use it at your camp to essentially just buy ammo, as ammo is a limited resource. Like there's some other things that you can buy, grenades, etc., but you'll get enough of these just from exploring that you don't need to do that. So you essentially by the end of the game just got like a ton of gold that you have like no reason or want to like spend anything on. So that economy system is a little weird on top of the progression here. You can see, as this being the first type of game that Shift Up have created in this, they've followed those typical like progression systems that these sort of Souls-like and action adventure games sort of have. You've got your skill trees and your gear and all that sort of stuff, but it's lacking that depth that really comes from experience and understanding how to create these like tangible systems that show how that progression advances you throughout the game time.
Wow, look at that! It's huge!
It's surprising to see a city in a place like this.
During its prime, over 100,000 people called it home.
So in Stellar Blade, you play as Eve, a member of the airborne squads from space sent back to a post-apocalyptic Earth ravaged by the Natiba race to save the planet once and for all. The setup here and the opening hours really strong as you sort of trying to figure out the mystery of the world and this post-apocalyptic Earth, as Eve's also trying to figure this out, and understanding what Earth is and all that stuff. And I was really intrigued by the story during my preview time. But a lot of this initial intrigue and mystery evaporates by about halfway through the game, right? Like a really good example of this is how Eve's so interested in the reign of Earth, right? Like at the very early stages, she comments about, oh, this is Earth reign and everything. And then by about the mid game, you run into a guy that's fishing and you're just like, sick, man, let's do some fishing. But, I think that there's a lot more depth into the character of Eve that could be explored there, as, I'm pretty sure they're not fishing in space. Maybe they are, but that isn't really shown as to how not only has she grown as a character in terms of understanding Earth and everything, but learning these new cool Earth things. Like I feel like there's so much more that could have been brought out of this fishing minigame in terms of bringing out Eve as a character to show that she's learning how to fish and, exploring that rather than just being like a little fun minigame that you can do. Like it's sort of missing some of that character complexity and depth that could really come from that. And that's also reflective in the journey across the game too. Like the story here has a really solid setup and it has a very obvious plot twist into terms of where it goes, which is, it's a little disappointing. Like I would have liked a bit more depth there. Overall, it's passable, right? Like I don't think the story is bad or anything, and I definitely would like to know more about this world. And that's what leaves me disappointed, is that I was really intrigued by the premise and the setup, but it just didn't go deep enough that actually really intrigued me. The core cast here of Adam, Eve, and Lily aren't portrayed in a way that's deep or intriguing enough to sort of carry a game like this either. There is attempts to have the three characters banter off each other, but the actual characters aren't deep enough to have clear banter that's quite interesting across this entire experience. Another downside here really is also the voice acting. It's just not really strong enough, which is kind of strange. Like I was looking in the credits when I completed the game, and Eve is actually voiced by Rebecca Hansen, who voiced Alfira in Baldur's Gate 3, who has one of the most incredible emotional scenes in Baldur's Gate 3 that is all just due to her voice acting. And that same voice actor here is voicing a very monotone character that just doesn't have it. Like it's hard to really say, and maybe that's the direction here, it could be the writing, I'm not really sure, but it's just something that I thought was odd. So what I'll say for Stellar Blade here is this is one of the best action combat systems that you will play this year, like if you choose to pick this up. But it's also clear that this is Shift Up's first attempt at a game like this. When you look at the systems surrounding that combat system, you can see that they've tried to emulate a lot of other games, but they haven't really understood the depth of what makes that good in other experiences. They've just seen that other games have economy systems and skill trees and gear slots, etc., and then just try to put that into this game without understanding the deep complexities of how those systems interact to further the development and progression of your action combat system, while the other side of the coin being, some of the difficulty spikes, the poor story presentation and voice acting in some regards, and writing. This whole connective tissue of the game it's hard to recommend as an entire product. Like I really, really love the combat system here. Like, I can't overstate that enough, right? I absolutely love it. I love the vibe of the music and the presentation in those areas. And when it hits so good. And you might really love that and connect with that. But if you don't, and some of the negatives I've mentioned in this video stand out to you, then it is a hard game to recommend. I do recommend you play Stellar Blade though, just maybe not at that launch price point as a full AAA title. Depends on what really stands out to you. If you want that combat system, jump in. If not, then you might want to wait for a sale. Now, conversely though, I do really wish Shift Up the best. Like, they have an incredible combat loop here, and I can't wait to see what the studio does next. But let me know any questions you have in the comments. Thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is NorZZa. I hope you have a great day.